Thank you for listening to this Podcast One production. Now available on Apple Podcasts, Podcast One, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
There is a place that is spoken about only in whispers. A dark area that spawns the beginnings of urban legends. A place where anything can happen and usually does. During the light of day, it hides just outside of view. But when the sun goes down, spirits, creatures of the night, roam free, and things do go bump in the night. It is in every state and every country, and there is no escaping it, no matter how safe you feel behind your locked doors and latched windows. So we invite you to turn down the lights and turn up your radio while we join Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis, your hosts, on a journey into the darkness on the edge of town.
Hello and welcome. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me, Tim Dennis. Hello, Tim.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing well. Hey, I've got to tell you, a good friend of ours reached out to me, and he's like, Dave, I don't know if you've ever had this guy on the show. And I said, well, you know, good friend, if you were really a good friend, you'd know we had this guy on the show. Because he's a fantastic guest. And he's like, well, I think it's time you revisit with him then. He's got a lot of stories, a lot of cool things to share. And, you know, it's one of those, that's the tough part about doing the show. It's exciting that we have all these great people to speak to through the years. 15 years almost, Tim. 15 years of programming.
We're getting there.
Yeah, to have this deep of a pocket of great guests to go to, that it's a good problem to have, that sometimes you forget the ones that you really like and want to get back to because there's always something new coming at you. But it's time for us to revisit, and revisit we shall. Joining us today, M.L. Behrman, Mojave Mysteries. I know we had him on a few years back with his book, Real Tales of Unknown Creatures, UFOs, Ghosts, Devil Cults, Giants, and Mysterious Murders in the California Desert. He's back with us to catch us up on some of the other stories and encounters that he has brought to light. ML, it's great to have you back with us, sir. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
I love your bio. It's just, how do I put it in the right way? It's very underwhelming. It's not like you're out there you're not a Harvard pedigreed, law student or something. Tim, this is my favorite part. He's like, I don't have a fancy pedigree or career to brag about. I'm just a guy who at the age of 54 decided to try writing a book. That's how he starts off his biography. Huh. And you got to love it because, ML, you didn't just decide to write a book. You are very passionate about this work and the research in the Mojave and getting out there and uncovering all of these strange stories. For listeners who may not be familiar with you or didn't hear your first visit with us, talk to me a little bit about your background. What kind of brought you to this? Why do you do what you do and have this fascination with that area?
Well, I've always had a fascination with paranormal and bizarre history and weird stuff. And like I say, I never approached it as an academic or an expert. I was just a guy who was very interested in this. But the difference is, so many times, as a kid growing up or a young person, you read books and read accounts and you're like, okay, that's really weird. And then you move to the next one. And I always thought, I want to go out there. I want to go to the actual location and look around. I want to talk to people if I can find anyone. I want to go look up old newspapers or contracts or anything that would give me maybe a different take on what had happened. Because so much of the time you find a lot of what are classic stories are just regurgitated endlessly, and no one ever really checks up on anything. And I happened to come to California like 35 years ago to work in the industry as I was actually a model maker for the art department, special effects and stuff. And I was also a wannabe writer. And I happened to work on a television show, paranormal television show for an overseas company. And they gave me a list of things to go investigate and gather footage on, witness accounts. And a lot of it I could find stuff on, but some stories I couldn't. And I went back to the producers. I'm like, look, I can't find anything on this topic. And they just looked at me like I was crazy and go, well, just make it up. I'm like, what?
No.
Make it up. No one's going to know. And I'm like, you can't be serious. And they're like, yeah. And, I don't want to be naive and stupid, but it was like, okay, well, how much of what I've read and imbibed, it just came out of the top of someone's head rather than someone going out and looking at stuff. So at the time, one of the locations that I got sent to was the Mojave Desert. And I came out here in the 80s, and I just fell in love with the place. And it was such an alien place to me because I had grown up in the Midwest, trees, lakes, green grass. And out here, it was like being on Mars and, a hostile environment and a whole different type of culture and animals and everything. And at first it was just, wow, this is a cool, exotic area. I love being out here. And then I started to meet people, and everyone had a story. And it all seemed to have weird stories. And then I started looking at some of the classics of what would be considered paranormal things, like UFO crashes, UFO sightings, animal sightings, creature sightings, cults, murders, everything that's in my book. And then that drove me to researching some of these, and then I found historical accounts going back 100, 200, 300 years that kind of had the same type phenomenon. So I'm like, wow, this area has a repeating phenomenon that people are interacting with over the centuries, and is there something out there? And I actually moved out to the desert a few years later, and at first I'm like, oh God, I made the worst mistake of my life. I'm kind of on the moon. But then I just fell in love with it even more, and for the last 30 years, I've just spent my time investigating when I can and talking to people and going and spending time at places, and it snowballs. As you know, I mean, you're an investigator. You know that when people find out that you're actually interested and not, immediately judgmental on whatever they're going to tell you, stuff comes out of the woodwork. I never told anyone this, but, so that helped me assemble a huge file of stories and things like that. And then I'm like, well, maybe I should try writing a book, but this time, rather than doing the classic things that everyone's heard before, I'm going to look for the small nuggets, the weirdness, maybe things that on their surface don't seem that connected, but when you start looking at a whole area and then a history, you start to see, like I say, a pattern, a phenomenon, a cluster of events. And so I started doing my books, and I started doing my YouTube channel, which originally was to just kind of promote my book, but it got so much more interest from people that wanted to share things. Because when people read your book, they can't really email you and talk to you and stuff like that. But on a YouTube channel, they can, in the comments, they can share stuff, and I encourage them to, and they can email you. And so I got a whole huge wealth of material from that, and that kind of brings us right up till today. I'm still not what I would consider an expert. I'm just a guy that goes out and actually looks on location.
Well, but that is an expert. I mean, you may not have gone to a school for this, but your school has been the classroom of life, going and injecting yourself into that area, hearing the stories, investigating the claims to separate fact from fiction. That, in my opinion, makes you an expert on what you're talking about. Now, when you start looking into this, obviously you're kind of sent on assignment originally, and then you tip it, realize just how strange things really are. Before we even get into all the different type of phenomena, and we'll mention, I'd like you to do just kind of a bullet point list, and we'll cover some of these points during today's program. But why do you think this area is so, I guess, highly activated for just strange things?
Well, you've kind of backed into what is the biggest thing I'm looking for is exactly that question. Is it something in the environment? Is it something that you can point to and go like, well, there's a different magnetic force at work out here because of the geology or the minerals? Or is it just because it's so vast and so uninhabited that things can transpire that can't happen in a more populated area? And is is there also just because it's such a hostile, harsh environment, does that affect people's perceptions of what they're encountering or experiencing out there? And that was kind of my guiding principles. And then I saw that everything from UFOs to ghost stories and murders and everything you can find out here. And if you were to look at generalities, I mean, why do people come to the desert? Well, it's either to hide from something they've done or to do something they don't want someone to see, right? There's a reason the military puts its most secret bases out here. Or they're adventurers looking for mineral wealth in some of the most remote spots there are. Now, today there's a lot more recreational stuff because we've got cars, we've got air conditioning, we've got radio and satellite phone stuff. So, short answer to your question, I don't know why this place is such a magnet for weirdness. I can't give you a single quantitative answer. It's like, oh, it's because of this. I'm kind of at the cusp of it. I'm finding that there are clusters of things in certain areas that seem to attract that, and then I'm now looking at like, okay, what is the scientific, geology, geography, magnetic, piezoelectric, all those forces, and then what are the cultural aspect that happens here? Maybe that's driving some of it. And right now, the only things I can concretely point to are that there are clusters, there are a similarity in the phenomenon over the centuries that people are reporting in these areas. So there's obviously something at work. What it is, well, that's the Mojave mystery, I guess.
Well, let's start to list off and we don't have to get into each one of these stories yet, but just list off when you say there's a lot of bizarre phenomena. What exactly are we talking about?
Everything, okay, like the whole UFO thing, with the whole gamut of things. Strange lights in the skies, strange encounters on the road, missing time, alien interaction, and military interference or supervision, right? That whole gamut of UFO type stuff. Then you look at murder. I mean, we've got everyone from Charles Manson and his cult-like family to tales of the dark mass and mysterious disappearances and weird sacrifices reported and found throughout the desert. We've got a huge range of cryptid creatures, everything from Bigfoot to living dinosaurs to strange flying creatures to Mothman-type entities, and then just general weirdness. And I'll give you a real quick historical story I turned up that I did an episode on called 30 Nude Dead Men. And this happened in 1904. I came across an account in the papers.
Wait a minute. This is called 30 Nude Dead Men.
Right.
All right.
How's that for a clickbait title?
Yeah, lay it on us, son. What have you got?
Okay. 1904, the newspapers in Los Angeles and Nevada carried articles about, at the time they were building the railroad down from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. And the stretch from Vegas to L.A. was still pretty much open and unsurveyed. And they sent out a survey team to, do the survey so they could lay tracks through there. And they came across this area where they started finding clumps of dead guys, 4 dudes, 5 guys, 6 guys at a time, all within a few weeks period. All were dead. Most of them were naked. They didn't show any signs of violence, but they did show signs of exposure. And of course, even during that time, they're like, well, what the hell is this about? And then the stories started. Well, they were tramps and laborers, which is a nice way to refer to your workforce, that were looking for
That's how I look
employment
at them.
through the railroad and had decided to tramp 100 miles through the open desert in the middle of the summer, looking for work and had perished. Well, that didn't fit what they were finding, because people, when they're exposed to the sun, they can become delirious, and often they will take off their clothes, but many times they do the opposite. They cover up as much as they can, or they burrow into things. And to find clumps of 4 or 5 guys at a time, to where it equaled over 30 people they found in this one little area, then the stories came out like, well, did they run afoul of some gang or outlaws that killed them, robbed them, and stole their clothes? Well, no, there were no wounds on the bodies. Was there a rogue Indian tribe that, or Native American reason for it? No, most of the Native Americans had been driven out of that area, and they wouldn't just massacre people and leave them, laying out there for no reason, because what would draw attention to you more than doing something like that? So then they wondered, like, is there a poison well or poison water that they drank from, and it drove them crazy, and they all took off their clothes and ran off into the desert? Well, there is a place called Dead Man's Well out there, but people don't know if it was because of that, what happened around it, or because of the water that supposedly came out of it. But some of the bodies were found far enough away from that. At the end of the day, they don't know what happened. It was the only thing they could say for sure was that they were naked. They looked like they had been there for maybe a week to 2 weeks, and there were no signs of physical violence on any of the bodies.
Well,
now, that little article...
Was there anybody, more importantly, was there anybody reported missing? A group of people or individuals from around that area?
Excellent question, and that's why people said, well, they must be tramps or road laborers that are just following the railroad and living in camps and not really in an established community where people would report them missing. Like, if dad and the cousins and the brother went off one day and never came back and then were found naked, well, yeah, someone would definitely want to know what's going on. So they assumed they were tramps and derelicts and stuff like that. But, the area, I don't know if you've ever been through that area. You guys are on the East Coast, right? So you probably don't know.
Actually, we're out of Minneapolis. We're on the East Coast of Minneapolis, though. So
right, okay. Well, you're center coast,
that's
the central coast. So that area is hot. I mean, like, god-awfully hot. That's where Google put their solar farm out there. I mean, it's just a sun-baked. It's beautiful, but, if you're out there on foot in the summer with no water, it would be hell on earth. So I just can't see people merrily tramping off, in a group through that area. So, sorry for the long-winded answer, but no, there was no reports of missing people. They couldn't identify who these guys were other than young men who were dead. So that story I found in the archives. I only found 2 articles detailing it, and then it just kind of disappeared because there were no answers. It was just one of those weird things that happened in the desert,
Well, with this group of people, do you know, because of the time, that's why I'm asking this question, were they indigenous or were they African Americans, laborers, something like that, that were out there?
The articles didn't really break that down. And this is me inferring from reading it, was that they were of the laboring class of the railroads at that time, which would be everyone from European immigrants to Chinese to African American. So it could be a mix. It never really stated. The only thing they said about the bodies were it was young men that were fit, but for some reason they categorized them under tramps, laborers, and transients.
So to the rest of lower than normal people back then, that kind of would have been that. So that there wouldn't have been as much attention or prominence to who they were, and would, in a sense, make sense to why they reported that way, because there was nobody of note to mention that was amongst this pile of bodies.
Yeah, obviously, if it was some rich rancher or mine owner, there would have been maybe a lot more outcry and outrage or interest in it. But you got to understand, the desert is so big, and if you read the accounts of the times, the 1800s, people were always like finding bodies or disappearing into the desert. And today, I mean, right now, I'm down by Joshua Tree, and we've got 3 open missing person cases in just the last year of people that car was found next to the highway, but they weren't, and where'd they go? And, or someone went hiking in the park, and they disappeared. Where'd they go? So we still have that type thing. And what's interesting is I went and looked, San Bernardino County is one of the biggest counties in America, and it covers a good swath of the Mojave. And I looked at the coroner's office records for 1870 up to 1920. And it was an underfunded office with like 1 or 2 guys, and one guy in particular seemed to get all the calls, and he was always having to go here, go there, go here, look at this, and it would take days to get to some of these locations. So out of 30 people maybe reported missing, he'd maybe be able to get to 1 or 2 within 6, weeks to 2 months. And that type of case backlog means a lot of stuff just gets swept away or not ever looked into or mentioned once and never revisited. And some of the accounts you read that came into his office are like, some guys out prospecting came across a camp, and there was a shallow grave with a board sticking out of it with a marker that just said horse thief or gold thief. Or, we went by this one water hole and we found a pair of legs and some pants sticking out of the sand, and that was all. So, the coroner would have to go out there and make some sort of determination like, yeah, the guy's dead, or, yeah, it's human, but we don't know anything more about that, or can't, ascertain anything more about that. So the area, because of its vastness, because of its harshness, and because of its remote population, a lot of stuff just never gets followed up. It gets swallowed up.
Now, do you think that those men were left there? I mean, the Mojave's a big place, right? They could have been left anywhere. Do you think that they were left there knowing that people were going to come that way because of what was happening at the time? Was that maybe meant as a threat, a way to try to shut down the line? What are your thoughts on this? I know a lot of this is just conjecture.
Yeah, well, that would be, people, look, some of the theories ranged from, the activities of the Black Mass. A cult killed these guys because they stumbled onto a secret or something. And then others were, mine owners in the area didn't want anyone prospecting, so they killed them and left them. If you're trying to send a message, you look at the horrible violence in the Mexican cartels and stuff. When they want to send a message, they cut your head off and leave it on the steps, or they hang you from a bridge with a sign or something like that. So what, it's like, hey, don't mess around down here because this is what'll happen. So to leave people in a sparse area in clumps here and there, I don't know what message you're sending. And the only people that at the time were going through there was a survey party that was, if a survey party's going through, it's because it's a pretty remote area and unpopulated. So that was, people were trying to figure out, is it a gang that, is trying to protect their hideout? Is it miners protecting a secret miner? And like I say, if you're trying to send a message by leaving a body, you do it a lot more than just scattering them around in clumps. If you're trying to keep a secret, why would you leave bodies out? I mean, that was the first thing that would draw attention. So you just bury them in a trench somewhere, and ride the horses over it, and no one could tell anything was ever buried there.
Well, since you brought it up and we talked about one horrific aspect of it, talk to us. Is it the Abo Pass gang? Am I saying that properly?
Yeah.
So talk to us about the Abo Pass gang, and that seems like a possible, maybe not necessarily a direct connection, but again, you were talking about the Black Mass and strange groupings.
Right. Well, that's an excellent segue that you've made, because go 10 years later, 1915, people found what the one single thing that triggered the case's investigation out here was they found a boot out in the desert, some prospectors, and it had a human foot in it, and it looked like it had been burned off just above the ankle. So they're like, okay, that wasn't like a lightning strike or, someone says this is a deliberate mutilation. And then they found a horribly burned body in a shallow grave a little ways away. And then they found some reports of ranchers that had gone missing or had reported being robbed, raped, and tortured by a gang. Now, they started looking around like, well, what gang? Why would they do this? What is this? Well, they found that over in New Mexico in the Abu Pass area, there was a gang that was notorious for doing just that. They would look for remote outlying ranches and mining camps. They'd ride in, grab the guys, and their favorite way of getting you to give up the goods was to, oil your leg or limbs and hold you over a fire. And sometimes it would go too far, and they burn the whole person, completely rather than just burn the limb off. And, of course, that got the authorities and the posses and the vigilantes on their trail, and they thought most of them had been exterminated between 1912 and 1915. Well, when this started happening out in California in the Mojave, people were like, hey, wait, maybe the gang just moved west. And they are operating with their same cruel techniques out here. Well, the thing was, they couldn't find enough witnesses that were alive, and they couldn't find enough evidence to point to that exactly. So stories started coming up like, no, this might be the work of a black mass. Now, at the time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they didn't say Satanists or satanic cult or stuff like that. They referred to it as dark forces or a black mass, people that were involved in some sort of anti-ordinary Christianity, which, if you're not, I guess, a Christian, the antithesis to that would be the devil. So, devil worship, but like I said, they call it the black mass. So people started postulating, well, is there a black mass at work out in the desert that is anyone who comes across or stumbles into their nefarious activities gets dealt with in a sacrificial way, which would involve fire, dismemberment, and hiding the bodies. Now, this all raged for like 6 months to a year, 1915 to early 1917, when either because they never found enough evidence, supporting evidence, or the cases just dropped off, or as so much happened, something happened somewhere else, and people kind of forgot about it. They never came up with an answer. The papers of the time postulated that it very well could be the Abu Pass gang, or people that were associated with it, or it was some sort of nefarious dark force at work in the desert. And it was left at that. And here's another great example of something that could be pure criminality, or it could be something that starts verging into the weird and bizarre happening in the desert, and it's just one more little link in the chain.
That is twisted. Now, you always hear in these vast remote areas, right? There's always some kind of cult activity. And aside from the 30 naked men found in the desert, have there been other indicators that maybe there are strange religious sects and cults that might have some secrets out there? I've got to guess the Mojave has to be the biggest graveyard that people are completely unaware but aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a common saying out here, and I've heard it from cops, that if every body buried in the desert could get up and walk, it'd be elbow to elbow. Because, like I said, if a lot of people come to the desert to hide something and stashing bodies and dumping bodies. A couple of years ago, just here in their Joshua Tree near the main highway, people were driving along. They saw a little fire in the next to the road, and they went and looked, and it was a body burning, some poor gal that some guy had left and set on fire there and driven off, thinking that probably he was in the middle of the desert, but he was really just off the highway. And so you've got, that type stuff. Now, specific to your question about cult activity, well, you look at something like Charles Manson and the Barker Ranch up in Death Valley, and a lot of people think Manson just did the Tate murders or his followers, but there's a whole lore that his people were serial killers that were killing people throughout the desert,
right?
And that I did a story on. There was one rumor that he would send the girls out to act as hookers at some of the remote places because, now go with me here, he and his followers had a passion for Volkswagen camper type vehicles. And that he would target, he'd tell them, go find people that have those and lure them out back to the ranch and we'll kill them and take their vehicle. And that there were bodies buried at Barker Ranch that were lured in through that activity or through just simple drug dealing to get money. And they even authorized a dig up there to look for bodies, but there was all these weird rules the BLM put on it, like they couldn't dig more than 4 feet down in suspected grave areas and, disturb different spots. So they didn't find anything, and the corpse dogs didn't turn up anything. Now, this led to an interesting conversation I had with a search and rescue guy that was there, and I said, well, if the corpse dogs didn't do anything, then there must not be anything there. And he's like, no. He goes, I wouldn't put a whole lot of credence in the dogs. He goes, I was working a case once where I was literally standing on a fragment of human bone, and the dog just ran past me, looking at something else.
We're friends with Sergeant Paul Dosty, who was a cadaver dog specialist, and his dog Buster. They went up there. As a matter of fact, he and Manson had a strange relationship in the sense that he was constantly in contact with Manson about this, and Manson was quoted as telling him, you and that effing dog are going to get me executed. Because he knew he was up there. And from my understanding, and Tim, maybe you remember, I think Sergeant Dosty said that his dog did mark, but they wouldn't allow them to do a dig there.
I believe so, yeah.
There was just weird rules. Sorry, Tim.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah, that's what, one of the weird things was just because of the bureaucratic rules, people couldn't find things. Now,
so here's the thought, though. Here's the thought. Sure. Okay, there's rules. But if Dave and Tim know that this place is where they marked and Dave and Tim go and dig and we find a body, how easily are we going to be forgiven if we find remains? As opposed to just disturbing it, or is the real crime here that Dave and Tim would end up doing 20 years in Alcatraz for digging up a spot and uncovering a burial plot, from the Manson family? Meanwhile, they won't ever find justice for those murders that took place.
Yeah, well, in the West, the battle between everyone from BLM managers and rangers and land managers and population investigators it's always contentious because sometimes they have rules that you just like that. You're like, well, this is kind of absurd. What's the more important thing here? And well, people that follow the rules by their job don't tend to be very open to negotiation. So it's a very diplomatic way of saying it's their way or the highway in a lot of these spots. So, well,
let's do this. We need to take a break. Mojave Mysteries will continue. ML Behrman, our guest today. When we come back, we'll talk about strange animals and cryptids. We'll talk about giants in the desert, underground cities. How about road ghost phenomena and UFO lore? That's just a small sampling of what we have on next, right here on Darkness Radio.
Hey, this is NFL Hall of Famer Ray Lewis. I'm excited to announce the launch of my new podcast, Everyday Greatness, the Ray Lewis Podcast. I'll be talking with friends, family members, old teammates, athletes, celebrities, moguls, And guess what? I'll be talking to you. Listen, this is all in the search for everyday greatness. So I'm asking you to come along with me on this ride. Download new episodes of Everyday Greatness, the Ray Lewis podcast, every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on podcast1.com. It's not what you have, it's what's inside of you that actually inspires greatness.
Welcome back to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio. I'm Dave. That's Tim. ML Behrman, our guest. We have a link up to ML's book and to his Facebook page and YouTube page on today's program so that you can find him, follow along. He's a fascinating host of these vignettes and digging into some of these strange mysteries, and we highly recommend you go take a look at that. This is a guy to keep an eye on because he's fascinating, has uncovered some remarkable things, and always has a great legend to share. Let's talk some more about the legends. I know people are fascinated by cryptids and strange creatures. What do we know about these cases in the Mojave? I guess I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised. You think that strange cryptid creatures are going to need heavily wooded and forested areas to hide. What can you tell us about cryptids in the Mojave?
Well, it falls into two groups, in my experience, is animals that are there that shouldn't be there, and animals that are beyond the realm of current naturalist theory and acceptance. Now, real quick, I did an episode on the Mojave elephant where in 1909, some prospectors out in the desert came across these huge tracks, that plate-like tracks, and they followed them for 10 miles, and one guy said, look, this is an elephant. And people were like, well, how would you know what an elephant looks like? And he said, hey, I saw one in a circus. I saw its feet. And they went into town and told people, and people said, no way, there's no elephant in the Mojave. And they went back out and found its tracks again and followed it for a further 18 miles. Well, the story came out that a circus train had been going through that area the year before and had stopped to water the engine, and they took the animals off to get them, let them stretch their legs, and one of the elephants got loose. They looked for it. They couldn't find it. They're like, hey, let's get back on the train and get the hell out of here. Because it was an older elephant, it'll die soon, and we don't want to get in trouble with the authorities. So it turned out there was a large African elephant loose in that section of the Mojave. Now, it was never found. Now, I've always said, wait 500 years or 1,000 years when some guy stumbles across the skeleton of a huge African elephant in the Mojave. If you want a real mystery, they're going to go like, how the hell did this thing get here? So that's a quick example of like animals that shouldn't be there that are there. And I've found that to be the case with lions, elephants, llamas, wolves, everything. Now, things that are really strange, like I grew up like everyone else looking at Bigfoot and all that stuff, and I always thought, but I love it. I love the idea, but there's just no way something like that could be loose and not be discovered. And if it is loose, it's in the middle of some forest somewhere and very remote part of the world. When I came to the Mojave, I was amazed to learn that there was a whole lore going back hundreds of years of giant hairy creatures and giant men and stuff like that. And I ran into it point blank because at the time I was trying to look at mining and getting into like understanding miners. So I found this old prospector who went out with me to show me mineral deposits and what to look for and why people would be in this area because they're looking for this type mineral. And we had stopped for lunch, and I had a rock in my boot, so I took my boot off and walked across some sand next to the truck. Now, I've got size 13 feet, so laughingly I went, look, Bigfoot. And totally straight-faced, he goes, no, Bigfoot's tracks are a lot bigger than that. And I'm like, oh, really? He goes, oh, yeah, I've tracked Bigfoot. I know exactly what they look like. And I'm like, you track Bigfoot. Now, it turns out this guy was an ex-Green Beret, had done 3 tours of combat in Vietnam. And he was a man tracker. So, because he was always pointing out tracks to me, like, yeah, that's a young bobcat, that's a coyote, so that's how I knew this man tracker history. So I was like, wow, you saw him in Vietnam, because I was thinking like somewhere out in Laos or way out in the middle of the jungle, he came across these tracks. He's like, oh no, I saw it up in Death Valley. I'm like, wait a minute, you tracked Bigfoot through Death Valley? He goes, oh yeah. I'm like, okay, well, we got to take a long lunch break here, and you got to tell me this.
Right.
So he told me this story that he and a buddy were up there exploring old mines, because at the time, this was back in the 1970s, he had just come back from Vietnam. At the time, you could still, or I shouldn't say you could, people would go to old mines and look for collectible things, antiques and stuff like that, and minerals, which nowadays you're not supposed to take that stuff away, obviously. And he goes, we were out in this remote area of the Panamints, which is a mountain range near Death Valley, or in Death Valley. And we were sitting around the fire one night, and we decided to take a walk after dinner, and we walked up this sandy draw to look at some formations that we had seen earlier and waited till it was cooler to go look. And he goes, so we walked up, he goes, we come back, and there's these huge pair of tracks came out from the rocks, stopped, and he goes, I could tell where it turned to look at us as we walked by, and then continued on its way. And he told me, I'm like, well, what did they look like? And he goes, well, they looked like giant, human-like tracks. He goes, human-like. They didn't have an arch in the foot. The toes were more in line rather than slanted diagonal like ours. And he goes, but I could see it. It had maybe come through 15 minutes earlier. I'm like, well, what'd you do? And he goes, well, I told my friend, look, if this thing's an animal or something, it's not going to know how many of us there are. So you keep talking like you're talking to me, and you walk back to camp. I'm going to hide in the rocks over here and see if this thing comes back, if it comes out again and follows you. And his friend obviously, wasn't too happy at that, but he's like, okay, man, but, don't let it come up on me. And the gentleman I was talking to, he goes, I had my gun, I had just come back from Vietnam, these combat tours, so I was, young and full of vigor, and I thought for sure I'm going to bag this thing if I see it. And he sat down in the rocks, and he goes, I just sat there quietly for 45 minutes, not a sound, just like I was on ambush in Vietnam. And he goes, after 45 minutes, there was nothing. He goes, well, this thing's not coming back or whatever. So he says he stood up, and he goes, the second I stood up, something stood up maybe 15 yards behind me, let out a grunt, and then took off. And he goes, I could tell it was running for the side of the canyon we were on, so I ran out into the middle of the canyon to look up to see when it came over the edge, it was going to silhouette itself, and I'd get a good look at its full form. And he goes, this thing was so fast, by the time I turned around, all I saw was this big shadow leap over the edge of the canyon and run off. And he goes, I could hear it running bipedal steps through the desert. Because in the desert at night, you can hear, if the wind isn't blowing, you can hear someone crunching away 150 yards away. He goes, so I ran back to where it had been behind me, and there were those same tracks. It was crouched down, and he goes, and then I had asked him, like, well, weren't you scared? And he goes, I wasn't scared till that moment, because when I saw that this thing was hiding behind me, I went, this thing was pulling the same gag on me that I was trying to pull on it. And he goes, that's not an animal. That's not, a bear will circle back and look what's on his trail and stuff like that. He goes, but this thing had just sat down and watched me, waiting for it to make its move, and then the minute I stood up, it took off. So this was a story he just told me, on a lunch break out in the desert. I'm like, holy crap, that's like, it's one thing when you read it in a book. It's, another when someone unprompted tells you something like that with that level of detail. Now, since then, I've found my own tracks, and I've talked to numerous people.
You found your own tracks out there as well?
Yeah, on 4 different occasions, I have found tracks. And I'll tell you a quick one. I was up in Death Valley with a buddy. We spent 4 days backpacking through the Panamints and northern section, Hunter Mountain to be exact. And one day we parked the Jeep on a trail, and we had to hike like 3 miles across this lava rock type, black rock area to a canyon that had a water source. And for thousands of years, Indians or Native Americans had carved things in the walls there, so we were going to go photograph it. And we crossed this open thing for 2.5 miles. We came up to a draw, an arroyo, which is like a small canyon with a sandy bottom. Now, in the desert, arroyos, canyons, stream beds act like highways. Animals will travel up and down those, so you can see what's coming and going. And they're usually going either to food or water. And this arroyo led up to this water hole, so you could see where coyotes, bobcats, everything. Now, as we walk in there, coming out of the arroyo and turning into this path we were on, was a set of prints. And they immediately caught my eye because they were pretty deep. And I went over to them, and you could tell they were kind of old because they were rounded. You know, when an animal makes a track, it'll be sharp, imprint in the ground. After the wind blows on it and the sun bakes it, it tends to get rounded and can actually get bigger slightly, so you have to be conscious of that. But these tracks looked like barefoot human tracks, but flat, you know, no arch, and with that weird toe thing. And they weren't giant. That's the thing at first. You know, they weren't any bigger than my foot, but they were, you know, 2.5 miles out in the wilderness in this area barefoot. And like, who the hell would be walking barefoot out there? Now, the other thing that caught my eye was I weighed 250 pounds. The guy I was with weighed 250 pounds. So I stood next to it to see how deep my track, went to this track. And this track went down another good 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch deeper than mine, which means whoever made these tracks, I mean, unless the ground was wet, which it wasn't in Death Valley, the amount of pressure you put on the ground is commensurate with your weight, or if you're jumping. Now, obviously, this thing wasn't jumping, it was walking. And I hadn't said a thing to my partner, and my partner was one of these guys who doesn't believe in anything. And I'm looking at it, and I see he's looking at some of them further down from me because there's a whole trail of them. And he looks at me, and I go, you know, I don't know what made this, but it was equally as heavy as us, if not more. And to me, it looks like it's on 2 feet. And he looked at me and he goes, you know, I was just thinking the same thing. So we followed these tracks for a 1/4 mile all the way up to this water hole. And we get to the water hole, and it was literally just that. It was like a kiddie pool amount of water surrounded by maybe 3 foot of muddy sand. So you could see where animals went up to the water, drank, and then turned around and came back and went back. Well, these tracks went up to the water, then they went through the water and out the other side and up the rocky canyon wall till we lost them, until the sand turned into rock. And just so whatever this thing did, it walked through the water and then went hand over hand and crawled up this rock wall. That was the first time I ever found anything. And the fact that it was in such a remote area, and it was such a clear indicator of behavior. It wasn't like, oh, I found a footprint on the trail. No, this was like out in the middle of the wilderness. Something for a 1/4 mile went up this wash near water, and then I don't know if it drank because you couldn't tell, but I could tell that it didn't turn around and come back. It kept going, and then it went up this near vertical rock wall. So, you know, it's like, okay, that is like, you know, it's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to like get down on your hands and knees and look at these prints and go, okay, what could have made this? You know, did some animal with weird deformed feet make this? You know, is it some weirdo out in the middle of nowhere that's barefoot? Well, no, because this area is just too remote. And what is the meaning of this behavior? Why it would do this? Anyway, I started looking. Then I started taking it serious. Like, okay, well, maybe there's something at work here that I got to look into. And I started going back into Native American folklore and history, and there were tales of giant hairy men and things out in the desert that they would encounter, and their interpretation is interesting. Some of the tribes would view it as a quasi-spiritual being, something that can move between two realities, and then others would treat it just like, no, it's just an animal. It's just part of the natural world. Some would call it the elder brother, the hairy giant, or the other, or hairy man is one of the biggest things that they would call it. So that was the first time I found something. And I don't want this to totally turn into the Bigfoot hour, but another great one I found that...
I'm just curious, so let me ask you one thing. So then where would these things live? Again, you have to forgive my ignorance here because... I'm Minnesota. I grew up in Chicago. I live in Minnesota. When I think of the Mojave, I think of flat sand, cactus, and howling coyotes and some rock out ledges. But where would they actually live? Well, and if you say a double wide, I'm gonna hang up the phone on you, Mel.
No. What you described is the land in between the mountain ranges, and just like some anthropologists postulate that anything in the Himalayas really lives in the valleys between the mountains and is seen crossing over the mountain. That's why you get tracks in the mountains where nothing could live in the snow. It's the opposite out here. We have black bear in the Mojave, but they don't live down on the sand, the rocks, and stuff like that. The only time you see them is when they're moving between the mountain ranges because of the weather change, seasonal change, or water or fire. And some of the Native American things call them, that they live in the mountains, and Nunumeric, which is a name they use, or man stealer, that if you go up in the mountains and get into their hunting areas, that you'll disappear or they will appear. So some people have, looking at it at a scientific thing, which is a conundrum in itself, postulate that what you're seeing is when the animal's traveling to different feeding grounds and living grounds. Because what you go to Death Valley, everyone thinks it's the playa, it's the racetrack, it's Furnace Creek, where it's 200 feet above sea level and it's 160 degrees in the day and all that. And yeah, that is all there. But you don't see the Panamint Mountains, Hunter Mountains, the different mountain ranges that go up 6,000, 7,000 feet, 8,000 feet, where you've got grass, water, forested areas. So there is a huge range of wilderness. And there are, I've seen deer and bear up in the high parts in Death Valley, bear down here near Joshua Tree. But so there is a whole ecosystem that is beyond just, the reptiles and rodents living in the sand. So that's the quick answer to you.
Yeah, I guess because again, listen, I think my exposure to the desert is what I've seen in every Western, which just seems like miles of nothing. But rock outcroppings and, passes that if you go through, the Cavendish clan are waiting to shoot you. So, it's interesting to get the real perspective that, that's part of it. But there are areas to live and, for these animals to flourish and stay out there. So you've got, now it sounds like Bigfoot is quite possible, and you've seen tracks, you've had trackers, that know what they're looking at, follow things like this. And I've got to guess too, walking in the desert barefoot, I don't like doing it when I'm in Florida. I can't guess walking in the desert sand how hot that must be on the bare feet. So this would have to be something that is adapted for that area.
Yeah, well, the area that we had crossed to get to the water hole was, this black volcanic rock. So it's hot. I mean, you could cook an egg on some of these rocks. And even with our hiking boots, you could feel the heat through your feet after a couple miles. So that's why, when we saw this thing coming out of an arroyo and moving towards water, we were like, okay, that was our first thing, is who the hell would be out here barefoot? If someone was lost, like a plane had crashed over the other ridge and this was the pilot walking out, you would, okay, why would he be barefoot? And he must be a big guy. And why would he leave the water? Because the last thing you can find in the desert is water. So to actively move away from a water source doesn't make sense either, unless you're going somewhere else, or where you're going, or it's just a stop on your path.
Well, and how hot does it legitimately get there?
Well, there's the three heats. There's the air temperature, and then there's the ground temperature. Now, the hottest recorded in Death Valley was like 134 air temperature, but the ground temperature at that time was between 160 and 210. So that's why in survival they always teach you, the ground will suck the heat out of you at night, but it'll also burn the hell out of you in the day. So, animals don't lie on the ground. They either make a burrow into the ground to escape the heat, or they stay, up in a rock formation or up in the mountains to escape the heat. So, answer your question, you're talking about oven temperatures. We were up there in the middle of the winter because that's the coldest thing, and it was still in the 90s in the day. And at night, it'll drop down to like the 40s, 30s. I mean, you'll get a 60 to 70 degree temperature change between day and night. That's why a lot of people don't understand that you can freeze to death in the desert just as fast as you can die of heat stroke.
Wow. So that is two drastic extremes and two more reasons why Dave and Tim will not ever be found in the Mojave Desert. That's amazing.
Yeah, I always hate making it sound like, to be scared of the desert, because to me the desert's beautiful, and you just got to be aware of what you're dealing with and be prepared. It's like the ocean. If you're stupid and don't respect it, it'll kill you real quick. On the other hand, you can live your whole life there and just have pleasant experiences if you understand the environment you're in, and you don't run into anything that's leaving tracks like that in the middle of nowhere.
Right. Well, let's talk about other strange things. Now, I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard that there are things like the great thunderbird, which Native American legend and lore talks about, but that there are things like pterodactyls, if you will, and dinosaurs of sorts that have been sighted in those areas. Now, is this heat stroke, people walking too far barefoot, fooling everybody that they're Bigfoot, leaving tracks, and they end up having these hallucinations? Or are there some credible witnesses that claim to have seen this strange and bizarre sightings?
I guess it's where you come down on the spectrum of that. I myself think most of it is comes out of a whiskey bottle, to be polite. But the stem of all this is, if you go back into the 1800s, and in my book I publish verbatim articles, and in my YouTube stuff I show verbatim articles of people at the time who ostensibly were from institutions of history, either from England or out east or the Smithsonian, who were legitimately following up stories of giant reptiles found in the desert, and iguanodons and different stuff like that, and then flying reptiles. Now, the flying thing has a corollary that might be a lot truer than a land-based animal, because, so many of these stories that I found were like, a sauropod, some huge four-legged plant eater out in the desert. Well, no, it's not going to be eating creosote and, living in sand. We do have big lizards, but they're like 1.5 feet, 2 feet long at most, because the environment just won't support that. Yet you'll have all these articles of people that swear they saw a huge dinosaur, and that natural history museums were out after them and stuff like that. But it never seemed to pan out, right? Like Bigfoot, seen but never captured. And not even footprints or photographs of footprints, just verbal accounts. And that goes right up till today, where I got emails from people that swear that they've seen not giant reptiles, but small bipedal, what would I guess be called a raptor, velociraptor or something, in remote parts of Death Valley. And I even had one account from a gentleman who said that they had captured one that was like the size of a chicken, and they kept it around their mining camp for 2 months until it escaped. And, the old thing, I'm always like, well, these days everyone's got a phone, so why don't you take some video of the dinosaur that was in your camp for 2 months so I can see it? I'd love to see it. And, those pictures never seem to come. So much of the terrestrial dinosaur stuff I find, I just, I listen, I look, but okay, I'm not seeing very much there. Now, we talk about flying reptiles or flying animals. There are a lot of big birds in the Mojave, and I've detailed historical accounts of people that, have shot, and pictures that I've put of giant eagles, giant hawks, giant owls, just really big birds. But there's also people that have swear they've seen pterodactyl and stuff like that. And there's articles going back where people swear that, their cow was attacked by a flying reptile, or they saw one. And that one article I had there's actually a series of articles that they shot one, and it came down, and they were able to get close enough to it, but it took off again, leaving these huge tracks that looked like alligator tracks and some blood. But again, no body. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen or heard about the famous saloon picture of cowboys standing around a dead pterodactyl.
You're right, right. And I've seen online, before you start sending me the pictures, folks, those are reproductions of what was once an actual photograph, as I understand. None of those are the real photograph that exists online, correct?
It's become a cottage industry with Photoshop to make your version of that picture and post it as real. So there's so many of them out there. I've seen one that supposedly is the authentic tombstone, because it supposedly came out of a saloon in Tombstone, that shows the actual photograph. And it's a good picture. I mean, it looks authentic, but I've seen so many that are like, yeah, okay, well, someone really got their Photoshop skills up because this looks great. But no one's been able to 100%, say for certain that this is the picture. But it's caused a whole folklore of people talking about, pterodactyls have been seen back in cowboy times and even photographed. Well, yes, they've been reported, but I've not seen a legit, in my opinion, legit photograph. Yet we still get these type reports. Now, I had an interesting incident. I had just finished this YouTube episode dealing with the story of pterodactyls that supposedly some scientists had seen in the 1890s, and then this reported shoot down of one. And I went for a hike that night, and I'm at dusk, and I'm out in the desert, and I see this thing gliding along, perfectly bat-like wings with this long head, and when it turned, it looked dead on like a pterodactyl. And I'm like, okay, no way, this is like straight out of the Twilight Zone. So I'm fighting to get my binoculars out as this thing gets closer. And it's not flapping its wings. It's just flying, cruising along on a thermal. And it gets up and turns just near me. And I could see what it was a pelican. Okay.
Oh, jeez.
Now, you go, a pelican in the desert. Okay, well, that's a little bit more believable, but that's still weird. Well, I went home and I started researching. I find that sometimes pelicans get blown in off the coast because I was maybe 150 miles from L.A. They sometimes get blown in from the coast, or they're visiting the Salton Sea, which is a large waterway out here down by Joshua Tree. And because they're cruising on the thermals, they'll just cruise along, and try and ride a thermal back out to the coast and stuff. So what I had obviously seen was a huge pelican, but it was brown, and they have that long head with the long beak, and he wasn't flapping like a sparrow. He was just cruising. So I thought to myself, well, there's a great example of one of the tenets of paranormal investigation, which I'm sure you run into, is there's three options. Either the person saw what they saw, either they saw something or misidentified it, or they're lying to you and it's crazy, made up. Well, this is number two. I saw something that I could have misidentified easily if I hadn't waited and rationally tried to see what it was. I could have said, I saw a giant reptile flying along, cruising along through the sky over the desert. But once it got close enough and I could see and I had my binoculars, I was like, oh, it's a pelican. Out of place, but still within the realm of possibility, but
right.
Definitely.
It is easy how it is amazing how easily your eyes can be deceived. I know driving one day, I had one of my kids in the car, and suddenly I saw this long silver cylindrical craft in the sky, the perfect cigar-shaped craft. I'd never seen one, and I thought, holy hell, are you seeing this? My son and I were just flabbergasted because we're both seeing it. I go, there's no wings. There's no tail. This thing is a perfect cylindrical flying object. And we were both just like blown away. I pull over to the side of the road so that we can watch this and I'm not weaving and ready to kill us. And then all of a sudden it tips and there come the wings. It was the perfect angle the plane was flying at with the sun glinting off it, creating the silvery metal effect. But it was at a perfect angle where you couldn't see the tail fin and the two side wings were tucked in. So it didn't. You think, how can a plane not look like a plane? You get it at the right angle, and it looks like a long cylindrical cigar-shaped UFO craft. And had I just looked up at it and not stopped to keep watching it, I would have sworn to you I finally saw one. But it took a few more minutes, and then when it tipped and those wings became, prominent, that I could see my mistake. So it's. That's why, folks, you can't just go on first glance. Sometimes you've got to examine it a little deeper, watch a little longer instead of reaching for your phone, which I know we all want that piece of evidence. Sometimes you just got to stop and look and be in that moment. And that's when you can see really remarkable or spectacular surprises.
I've seen the exact thing, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I saw a Cessna once that was turning, and the way it was banking, I thought the same thing. I'm like, wow, it's a rod, it's a cylinder, and then it finished its bank turn. I'm like, oh, it's a plane, so I know exactly what you're saying. Now, if you want to get off flying animals for a minute, I did see, I've had 2 UFO type sightings, and if you want to segue into that real quick, I'll tell you how I applied that same thing to what I saw, which, okay, I'll just give it to you real quick. I was down in the little San Bernardino Mountains. I was in a ravine. I was driving through late at night in July under a full moon. Now, that might sound weird, but in the summer, we do a lot of exploring at night because it's cool. And with the moon out, it's so bright, you can see stuff. So everyone from rock climbers to hikers to whatever, do a lot of stuff at night. So I was coming through this canyon by myself. I stopped to get out and relieve myself. And I'm standing there, and I happen to look up, and over my left shoulder comes this glowing ball, right? Now, immediately, we have Mylar balloons out here that people release for birthdays and stuff like that, and they'll catch the sun and look real weird. But immediately I went into investigation mode. I'm like, okay, this thing's moving against the wind. It's not making any noise. I held out my arm, my left arm at length to measure it, and it was almost exactly the size of my thumbnail, right? At arm's length as it's coming over. And it was a fiery gold color. Now, this was at night, so it wasn't reflecting the sun unless it was, up at the moon level, but it obviously wasn't because it flew between me and the moon. And I would guess it was maybe 300 to 500 feet off the ground. And it had this like corona discharge around it, staticky discharge. And, at first I'm like, wow, is that like ball lightning, or some sort of static discharge? Because we do get that type weird stuff out here. And I look at, and it flies over and disappears over the rim in front of me. So it was only in view for like maybe 20 seconds. I jump in the Jeep, go ripping up the trail till I come out on this flat valley surrounded by mountains. And it took me maybe 25, 30 minutes to get up there. And I get out the binoculars and jump out, and I'm like, oh, damn, I can't see it. All of a sudden, here it comes out between the mountain peaks, comes towards me, does a turn, stops dead, and then starts to change colors. I get the binoculars on it, and I can see it's not flashing like a light bulb. The colors are washing over the surface of it like dye in water. It would start to turn red, and then it would be red, and then it would start to tail into pearl-like white, and then it would turn into a bluish color, and then it would have this aura around it, and then it started to go straight up. And as it went straight up, it started to get what looked translucent. I couldn't tell if it was just moving through the atmosphere, the clouds, or what. And then it winked out, right? And I'm going like, holy crap, I actually saw something I couldn't readily point to and go, oh, that's a plane, because this was a ball. And not 2 seconds later, I hear this low-pitched thudding, and I look behind me, and here comes this blacked-out helicopter hugging the ground, and it flies right over me, maybe 50 feet up. Now, the area I was in was just the edge of Joshua Tree Park, and you're not allowed to fly in the airspace of the park under 500 feet. This thing was maybe 50 feet up. It was completely blacked out, and it was shaped really weird. And just a quick jump, I saw the shape later when I saw the footage from the Bin Laden raid, and the one stealth helicopter crashed, and they had to burn it. It had the exact same sloped control surfaces because it's radar stealth. So I see this thing come right overhead. It was so close I could look up through the cockpit and see the pilot flying with his goggles on, these giant bug-eye night vision goggles. Not a single light, nothing. And it went straight in the direction of where the ball had gone and then hugging the ground, and then it, too, ascended into that area, into the distance. I was like, wow. Not only did I see like a UFO, I saw a Men in Black, a blacked-out helicopter. This is incredible. Now, jump ahead maybe 4 years. I was doing a show where they had invited a bunch of us to, recite what we had seen or just discuss things. And I met a guy who does a lot of stuff in the desert, and, we were sharing stories off camera. And I told him this story I just told you. And he goes, I saw the same thing. He goes, I was out in the desert. I saw this glowing ball come out between the mountains, but then I saw a helicopter right behind it, bird dogging it. And he goes, I saw it move, right off the nose of the chopper and circle around and go back behind the mountains. He goes, I think it's a drone or some sort of military thing they're testing. Now, he had just said that when behind us, one of the guests on the show was a biologist for California, and her role on the show was basically to be the adult in the room and debunk everything we said, So right. she was like, everything we had talked about that you and I have talked about, she'd be like, oh, that can't be, or that doesn't do that, or this is a case of people without scientific credentials making conclusions.
Right.
So anyway, I didn't know she was standing behind us. And all of a sudden she goes, oh, that must have been what I saw. And we turn around and we're like, what? You just were on camera telling us we're crazy. And now she goes, well, She goes, that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm not supposed to see things. But me and my husband were out in the desert one night, and we saw this glowing ball come over and go in a straight line with a helicopter weaving behind it. And she goes, we all looked at each other like, okay, well, either we all get on the same bus to the asylum, or we saw something that they're either testing or tracking out there. So
now that I would buy, maybe testing or tracking, but I've got to tell you something straight up bizarre, Emil. We host these live events all over the United States, these darkness radio events, and one of our final events was at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, of all places, and it was hot, and there's really no breeze inside the prison, and I think it was like an August event or something along those lines. And I went outside during the ghost hunt to get a breath of fresh air, which is, ironic because all the smokers were standing out there. Right. As we're all kind of standing around, I just started looking up at the sky. It was a beautiful night, but it's a big city. So, a lot of the sky is blanched out, so you can't see the stars as well. But as we're all looking up, this craft comes ripping across the sky. I mean, ripping across the sky. And within seconds, 2 Black Hawk jets come tearing up behind it. And boom, that thing was gone. Like, it was going unbelievable speeds to begin with. But as soon as these Black Hawks start closing in, this thing just pop, and it was gone. Nothing left to see. Unbelievable.
Right. Well, the videotape they've released off the coast out here of the pilots running into what they call the Tic Tacs, flying little things that exhibit stuff. So, and some of our crash retrieval stories out here, I've heard cases of people seeing, the choppers come right in right away when something goes down, so meaning they were tracking and following it. Now, I know in the 60s and early 70s there was actually a team on call. It was Project Moondust, that the government kept retrieval teams on call for, if satellites from another country came down so we could grab it, or a plane, technology, foreign technology retrieval. And some people postulated, well, they have the same thing for anything they're tracking in the atmosphere unexplained. Is this cat and mouse you're witnessing, or is it a test you're witnessing, or, something in between? There is enough phenomenon that goes on. Now, key thing you said is you're over a populated area where the airspace is very, very controlled and monitored.
Right.
And in the desert, everyone thinks, oh, it's totally open. Things are just buzzing around because they can't track them. Well, no, There's radar. So many areas that they can paint the sky almost anywhere. And they test a lot of stuff out here because there's not people, that can see them. And if something goes down, they can control the area a lot easier than if it crashes in some neighborhood in suburbia, right? Out here, people didn't know about stealth technology for quite a while, but we did have some stealth crashes that they cordoned off the area. And I ran into a guy who was working with advanced drone technology, and I had told him about my second UFO thing, which was kind of a drone-like thing. I saw triangular formation of lights that then broke up, and they all went different directions. And I was telling him that, and he started laughing. He goes, "Oh, that's us." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, we test stuff a lot, and a lot of people think drones are these giant mini planes that were zapping terrorists with Hellfire missiles." He goes, "Really, we're dealing with swarm technology where we make like an insect-sized thing, but we'll send out like 6 of them information, and each one of them has a different target or different flight plan programmed into it." So he was telling me, his statement was, they go down all the time. And he would tell me stories of like how they would have to cordon off an area, turn people away from, roads and stuff like that. And where he had even been caught up in one of those, he didn't have his credentials, for that particular retrieval thing or whatever operation they were running, and he got turned away at the perimeter. He was with another guy, and he said, yeah, it was your classic, came along the dirt road, and there's a roadblock with guys with unmarked SUVs standing there with automatic weapons who are like, yes, sir, I'm afraid you have to turn around and go back. You can't go through this area. Which, boy, once I started investigating things, so much that happened in so many different stories that it gets regurgitated back into like Roswell. You know, they're turning people away and telling them if you talk, you'll be killed and all that stuff. And I had asked him about that. And he goes, oh, no, they were very polite. They offered to gas up my truck even and give me a sandwich while I waited for the tanker to come up. He goes, but they were definitely, we'll help you get out of here, but you're not going through here. And he learned later that was because of the crash of the test he had been working on. They had lost some aircraft. So who knows what's up there, but there's a lot of things up there.
All right, we've talked about some of the UFO sightings, obviously some of the things you've seen. Before we move off of that, people are always fascinated. What about aliens themselves? Have there been many alien sightings in and around that area? And if so, what type? Are they just the grays? Are they different forms? What can you tell us?
A to Z. Now, there was a crash retrieval episode in Kingman, Arizona in 1952 that is straight out of Roswell. You know, a craft came down. It was damaged. There were bodies, but there was one survivor who was a reptile-type humanoid, but with reptile tendencies. And they took him away, and he helped their government design stuff. Okay, so that's straight out of 1950s sci-fi comic book lore. And there's an example of that type case. But the ones I've come across that are a lot more interesting were people that report missing time or disjointed time, where they'll be on a deserted road. There's one lady coming through Death Valley, the dirt road that comes out of Death Valley to Baker, which is a long stretch of your classic dirt road in the middle of nowhere. And she saw lights flashing ahead of her. She stopped. When she got up to it, she stopped because she thought she saw someone standing in the road, a tall figure. And she stopped and was looking at it. And the next thing she knows is there's something right at her side window, a shadowy figure that put up a hand onto the window. And she said the hand looked like a chameleon's scaled hand, and that the window started vibrating at a really high rate. And she goes, next thing she knows, she passed out. She wakes up, it's almost morning. This happened at like 7 at night. She wakes up, it's almost morning. Everything's clear, there's no shadow figures, there's no lights. But she notices that her shoes are off and they're on the seat next to her. And that her keys are still in the ignition, but the lights are on the car. The engine's off, keys are in, but the lights are on. And she just feels like something happened in that missing time that she can't figure out. And she went and continued her thing and went to her daughter, and daughter's house was where she was going originally. She goes there, and for the rest of her life, she eventually told her daughter about this story when she was dying of breast cancer, so she had kept it to herself. But being a very religious woman, she interpreted it as demonic visitation or a demonic encounter. She didn't really say aliens, UFOs, whatever. But when you look at her statement or what she told us, you have the classic elements of close contact story, right? Missing time, weird things seen, flashing lights. Now, I had another couple tell me that they had a missing time thing where they had rented a mobile home, RV, gone on trip through Death Valley, and on their way out, they pulled over because they felt really tired. And they all got into the bed in the back, or the beds in the back, and woke up 23 hours later, and were like, what happened? You know, they felt obviously a segment of missing time, but their interpretation of it was, and actually the wife said this, was, I feel like the military did some test on us, like they zapped us with something, and, you know, what happened in those intervening hours, I don't know. Now, I've got a lot of accounts like that, which, are they UFO? Are they alien? Are we back to military testing? You know, what is it? So there we got everything from a reptilian classic, you know, UFO technology recovery story, that all the way to something that could be interpreted as demonic or interdimensional, and then all the way to like a military test type thing.
Right.
So answer, yes, we have alien stuff. It's kind of like pick your flavor, because we got a story somewhere that will recount that. And I actually love looking at a personal note is I kind of reject the hardware alien thing. I just don't see any advanced life like that buzzing around in some craft that, oops, we crashed. You know, it's like, damn, I told you to pay attention. You know, it's like, I just don't see that. I see it as a lot more advanced, and so what I look for is what I call the high weirdness factor. You know, something that's just so strange that you're like, okay, well, either this is a mental aberration or something really bizarre that contravenes our known physics at the time is at work here.
Let me ask you, and I want to go on to some of the ghosty aspects of this as well before we wrap up today, but the Mojave, does it run over a fault line? Is there any geomagnetic principles, a piezoelectric sensation, something to it that might give us a little bit more insight to the type of phenomena that's cited there?
You've heard of the San Andreas Fault, obviously.
Yes.
Right. Well, that runs right under the 10, right up through Joshua Tree, over to the coast. Then there's all sorts of fault lines through the desert. Now, piezoelectric effect, when you have a granite and you grind granite against granite, you can get what's called the piezoelectric effect, which is an electronic static release or an electrostatic release, energy. And we have a thing that people claim to see called earthquake lights, and it'll be like a shimmer or a spark or a fireball. Some people have postulated that because we've got this tectonic plate movement underneath, that when these giant megaton formations of granite grind against each other, crystal on crystal, you get that type of release. Now, the Army or the Armed Forces are working on disruptor technology, which is basically they can fire a high pulse of either electromagnetic energy or pure electricity at your head, at your body, and they found that if you hit someone's frontal cortex with a big enough charge, you can trigger like an epileptic seizure. You can they report all sorts of classic things like hallucinations, weird tastes in the mouth, nausea, falling down straight till where, if you hit them hard enough, you can kill them. Now, if the Mojave being formed on active fault lines, and you've got that type of energy being released in bursts here and there, along with the fact that we have huge mineral deposits of uranium and different radioactive things, is it too much to postulate that people could be getting dosed or hit with a energy source that it's natural in the sense that it's being made by something natural in the ground, but it's triggering this type hallucination, or maybe it's triggering, then you get into the people that are into vortexes and, interdimensional stuff, and what's happening is the energy is creating a pathway between universes, and, well, I'm not sophisticated enough to go there, but I am aware enough of all this thing to look at, like, okay, are there fault lines? That's what when I talked about cluster stuff, I look at, like, okay, why is it that people are reporting all this phenomena, but it falls directly on this fault line, or that there are huge deposits of radioactive rare earth minerals in these areas. Now, you go back to frontier times, prospectors and miners, they used to have what they called spook lights. And, you know, the folklore version was that they were the ghosts of murdered Indian shaman or outlaws or people that got lost in the desert. And a lot of the prospectors said, no, they're actual discharge of rare earth minerals, and we look for it at night. You know, you can actually see a green glow or a shimmer where there's uranium, you know, just close to the surface. And they gave it the name spook lights, and that was one of the things they would look for when they were out trying to file a claim on those type materials. So, short answer, yes, there is a active geological, geographic, magnetic, tectonic activity happening under the Mojave that could very well be a causative factor, the causative factor, or it could be a, you know, one of the elements that leads to such a high level of like I say, high strangeness.
Very interesting indeed. Before we wrap up here today, we wanted to get to the experience with ghosts, and it sounds like this kind of dovetails nicely into that as well. Talk a little bit about how ghosts fit into your experiences as well.
I started looking into what I had heard some stories from truckers about what they call the road ghost phenomena, which, and see if you've heard this before from your childhood, you know, the guy is going down the empty road at night, he sees someone hitchhiking, usually a ghostly, pale-looking woman, picks him up, they sit quietly next to him, the guy checks his mirror and looks back, and they're gone. They stop at a roadhouse further down the road and tell the guy behind the counter, and the guy behind the counter says something like, oh, you saw it too, or oh, yeah, there was a car that overturned, 10 years in that exact spot 10 years ago, and the lady was killed, and now people see her occasionally up on the road. So I got verbatim some accounts like that, and what interested me is when I was a little kid in grade school, we used to tell stories like that, that the lone hitchhiker, the ghost, and all that. Mm-hmm. So I started looking into it, like, well, okay, truckers are still reporting that. Then I got an interesting corollary to that, where one guy told me about, he was at a truck stop, he saw this weird dude in a long trench coat holding a sign saying 7 more miles, please, standing out by the edge of the road by the truck stop, a hitchhiker. And he goes, I passed the guy, pulled out, it was late at night, I went out on the road for an hour, no one passed me. He goes, all of a sudden, under a overpass, here's the same guy standing with his gray coat on with the sign that says 7 more miles, please. But he goes, I swear it was the same guy. And he said, no one had passed me. And I was with my wife, and we looked at each other like, okay, that's weird. How is that the same guy? How did he get there? And if it's not the same guy, how come he's dressed the same with the same sign? He goes, 45 minutes later, I got passed. He goes, by one car, and I could see its headlights in front of me much of the next 45 minutes. He goes, there the guy is again off on the off-ramp that we went by. And same guy, same dress, all that. And he goes, yeah, by then my wife was so freaked out. She's like, okay, don't even, we're not stopping at the next stop. We're going straight through. And he goes, he didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a solid guy. He goes, but how do you explain how this figure leapfrog past me and, appeared at the same spot on the side of the road that I kept passing? Now, that's an interesting, I use the term road ghost phenomena. I hadn't really heard other people say that, but it seems like it all lumped into the same type phenomenon happening. So I go back and start looking at accounts from earlier times, and I found there's this whole, you've heard of the headless brakeman?
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The idea that a train in the middle of nowhere, and this was recorded out east as well as out west, but a lot of stuff from out west, going through the desert, they see a red light swinging up ahead. They stop the train. They get out. There's no one there, but the bridge around the turn is washed out, or the tracks have been messed with, and the train would have derailed. And the headless brakeman, I mean, the story goes that some guy, brakeman on a train, and the train crashed, and he died, got his head cut off in the wreckage, and ever since then, his ghost has been warning people on, that stretch of the highway or the railway to slow down, that there's danger ahead. Now, I went and looked even farther back, and there were people reporting the same thing, stagecoaches and carts and stuff like that, back to, the very late 1700s and early 1800s out here. So you look at a phenomenon, like I say, and you guys being investigators, I'm sure you, like you say, you look for a timeline, you look for a phenomenon that repeats over time, and you look how it changes over time or how it doesn't change over time. And here you've got entities supposedly interacting with travelers in remote areas to warn them of whatever, going from stagecoaches to trains to semi-trucks. So I find that a fascinating thing. I'm sure, like anything, it could be put down to fatigue of travel, misidentified something. They just happened to luckily stop where the thing was done. But on the other hand, why is there such a continuity in what's happening, and why does it seem to interact with humans that are engaged in a certain activity, travel, in a remote area?
True. I do have a question as far as the energy part of it goes, and in the fact that there's a physical interaction as well. And what's interesting in some of the stories that you've told, especially with other stories that you told, the stories before we got into ghosts, it seems like there's an interactivity with the energy of different spirits as well. And I'm wondering if you can get into that too. Do you feel like with spirits in particular that the energy from a spirit has a physicality to it? And if so, why?
Well, you raise a great point because, I've looked at it from like, okay, are all these phenomenon basically interpretation, and that we're carrying all the elements of what we see inside of ourselves, and it's something in the environment triggers our then manufacturing the sighting or the encounter or whatever. Mm-hmm. Now, that would be, whether it's a radioactive piezoelectric pulse from the ground hits your frontal cortex and you've always feared ghosts, so you see a ghost, whatever. Or you look at cases where there's actual physical clues left. Like I say, I found footprints. I saw the glowing ball.
Right.
I've encountered other stuff. Well, okay. Did I misinterpret what I saw? Or if I didn't, how do you explain that being there right in front of you? And it hit me, and like I say, I haven't seen ghosts, but I have found footprints, and two guys on different occasions that were with me don't believe in any of this. And I looked at them. I looked at the thing from every angle, and I looked at them and go, okay, if you could tell me what made that or how that got there, I'm all ears. Lay it on me. And they were both like, I have no clue. I can't tell you what that is. And I'm like, well, you can't deny that that's in front of us. Mm-hmm. So it either means there's something going on that we don't know about, or our conception of what reality is still has a few gaps in it. And I think that's the biggest puzzler, is when you can find concrete physical proof, then that forces you to start looking at, okay, well, what is the next step? What is the next theory? What is going on? What am I looking at? What am I experiencing? And, within that, I look at things when I do my historical research. I look how other people might have had the same type encounter, but how they interpret it through their culture or technological level of the time. And with the ghost thing, okay, they might be dressed in a duster holding a sign that they painted, or they might be, the ghostly figure in white gauze, or it might be some horrible creature-like looking thing, or it might just be lights and electrical discharge and stuff. Okay, something's at work there, but is it because I'm a truck driver that I see it as a hitchhiker? Is it because I'm a train man? I see it as a brakeman? Is it because I'm in a stagecoach? I see it as just a light? And I even take that when you look at UFO stuff, because a lot of the early UFO reports from the 1800s, they called them mystery visitors, mystery airships, electro ships. It was like they were seeing these things that they were interpreting through their technological level. Powered aircraft and spaceships didn't exist, so they saw it as zeppelins, balloons, or just weird lights. Right. And then today, then we move through the flying saucer stage. And now we're getting to where we're seeing flying Tic Tacs and balls and morphing objects or winged little insect-type drone stuff. So the phenomenon, whatever it is, manifests itself differently in the era based on what the technological level is that we as people bring to the equation. So I often ask myself, is it almost like something's guiding us to a purpose, like it just holds out enough in front of you to make you ask the question, but it doesn't make it so advanced that you can't even form the question. If you took someone from the rainforest and tried to show them, a nuclear reactor, they might not be able to make the jump because they don't have the intervening 2,000 years of technological hardware experience. Not that they couldn't figure it out, it's just they don't have that experience. So would something operating on a different bandwidth than us bring us along by just feeding us enough tidbits to keep us reaching, but not giving us enough to actually grasp it? And I find that being the underlying principle behind all the phenomenon I've studied in the Mojave. It's always just out of grasp, but it's just enough that we can understand what we're seeing or experience at the time, or at least put it into words.
Understandable. And I wonder, too, when you talk about, if science looks at it as a mass hallucination, if that mass hallucination really does come with the physicality part of that mass hallucination, too. I tend to look at it from a skeptical point of view as well as a believing point of view as well. Interesting stuff. It's interesting stuff indeed. ML, I tell you what, we're at the end of our time here. But folks, I want to encourage you to go out and check out the book. ML, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. ML Behrman has Mojave Mysteries, Volume 1. The information is available on the description of the show. And ML, tell people where they can check you out on YouTube.
If you go to YouTube and just YouTube/Mojave Mysteries, you will find my channel, and there's 43 episodes there of all the stuff I've talked about.
All right, great. Folks, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this holiday weekend. Hope you stayed safe throughout this weekend and that nobody blew off any digits playing with fireworks. We encourage you to stay safe with all incendiary devices celebrating your freedom this weekend. And by all means, stay safe and social distance, and by all means, keep yourself well throughout the weekend. We will see you again on Tuesday for True Crime Tuesday. Remember, if you haven't subscribed to True Crime Tuesday, you can do that by going to darknessradio.com, following the prompts there, and subscribing there. And also, join us again next weekend for the best in paranormal talk radio. This has been Darkness Radio.